Hello and welcome to The Top Story, a podcast with headlines of the day from our correspondents around the world. I'm Tian Yu. Coming up in this edition, the Munich Security Conference has wrapped up after 3 days of speeches and talks amid a tense atmosphere. US and Russian officials will have their first face-to-face meeting this week to discuss an end to the conflict in Ukraine. The M23 rebel group has pushed into Bukavu in the Eastern Democratic Republic of the Congo. We begin in Europe. The Munich Security Conference has wrapped up amid worries over the future of the transatlantic relationship, as U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance's speech has caused much unease. Conference Chairman Christoph Heusgen has voiced concern that common values between Europe and the U.S. are dwindling. Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi's messages have met with much appreciation as he stressed partnership over competition.
China has always believed that Europe is an important pole in the multipolar world. China and Europe are partners, not rivals. This year marks the 50th anniversary of the establishment of diplomatic relations between China and Europe.
For more, here's Evangelist Sipsas reporting from Munich.
Security, trade tensions, and transatlantic rifts took center stage in Munich, with U.S. officials pushing Europe to step up funding on its own defense. But the talk from Washington wasn't just about outside threats. Officials from Donald Trump's administration want to discuss domestic issues and highlight what they say are problems within Europe itself.
The threat that I worry the most about vis-a-vis Europe is not Russia, it's not China, it's not any other external actor. And what I worry about is the threat from within, the retreat of Europe from some of its most fundamental values, values shared with the United States of America.
But the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz flipped the script, putting the focus on outside interference. On day 2, he made it clear that any attempts to influence European democracy, especially in favor of the far-right AfD, is a red line.
That's why we will not accept it if outsiders intervene in our democracy, in our elections, and in the democratic formation of opinion in favor of this party. That's just not done.
The president of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, also took a shot at the U.S., but this time over trade, warning that if they slap unfair tariffs on the EU, Brussels will hit back.
Unjustified tariffs on the European Union will not go unanswered. And let me speak plainly. We are one of the world's largest markets. We will use our tools to safeguard our economic security and interests.
On the other hand, China took a calmer approach, steering the conversation toward partnership instead of competition. And of course, Ukraine was a major topic over the past 3 days, with talks about peace, financial aid, and who should lead the negotiations. But the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky took the conversation even further, discussing about something Europe has been debating over years, its own army.
Let's be honest, now we can't rule out the possibility that America might say no to Europe on issues that threaten it. Many leaders have talked about Europe that needs its own military.
As the walls at the Munich conference come down and leaders leave, the big debates aren't going anywhere. Security, trade tensions, and transatlantic rifts took center stage, and now the real work begins. Next stop, Paris. European leaders will tackle Ukraine aid and defense, but unity won't come easy after Munich's tensions. The conference may be over, but the questions remain open.
That was Evangelist Sipsas on the just concluded Munich Security Conference. Meanwhile, US and Russian officials will meet this week to discuss an end to the conflict in Ukraine. The White House Middle East convoy Steve Witkoff is scheduled to be in Saudi Arabia for the talks. The upcoming discussions will be the first face-to-face meeting between Washington and Moscow about ending the 3-year conflict. Popim Punting reports.
A U.S. delegation led by Secretary of State Marco Rubio is set to hold talks with Russian government representatives in Saudi Arabia this week on resolving the Ukraine conflict. The upcoming meeting follows a 90-minute phone call last week between US President Donald Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin, which Trump called lengthy and highly productive. Later, Trump alluded to a possible face-to-face meeting with his Russian counterpart in Saudi Arabia. Although Trump also spoke to Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, it's been a turbulent few days between the US and its European partners. At last week's Munich Security Conference, US Vice President J.D. Vance lambasted the EU. Meanwhile, US Special Presidential Envoy for Russia and Ukraine, Keith Kellogg, confirmed the peace deal negotiations would be bilateral, excluding Ukraine and European allies. Although Rubio spoke by phone with his Russian counterpart Sergei Lavrov, the US Secretary of State, during a TV interview on Sunday, played down concerns Ukraine and Europe are being sidelined.
We stand ready to follow the president's lead on this and begin to explore ways, if those opportunities present itself, to begin a process towards peace. Now, a process towards peace is not a one-meeting thing, but if that were to happen, Ukraine will have to be involved because they're the one that were invaded. And the Europeans will have to be involved because they have sanctions on Putin and Russia as well. And they've contributed to this effort. We're just not there yet.
The apparently close and cordial relationship between Trump and Putin has prompted the Europeans to schedule an emergency meeting for Monday about security on the continent. During the Biden administration, Washington and Moscow did not hold direct talks about the Russian-Ukrainian conflict. That's now changing under President Trump. But talk about a possible path to NATO membership for Ukraine appears unlikely.
That was Popin Putin on the upcoming US and Russian official meeting on ending the Ukraine conflict. Some European leaders are alarmed by comments from the US envoy on Ukraine that the EU should have no role in peace negotiations. While French President Emmanuel Macron is holding an emergency meeting of European countries to discuss the Ukraine conflict, British Prime Minister Keir Starmer says he's ready to send troops to Ukraine if needed. Meanwhile, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky and his wife have arrived in Abu Dhabi days after the UAE offered to hold talks aimed at ending the conflict with Russia. Rahul Pathak has more.
After 3 years of conflict in Ukraine and an apparent stalemate between that country and Russia, the new Trump administration in the United States has wasted little time in pushing forward its ideas for ending the war, while also seemingly alienating its European allies. At the Munich Security Conference, Donald Trump's special envoy for Ukraine gave a blunt assessment on what role Europe should have in any future negotiations.
Can you assure this audience that Ukrainians will be at the table and Europeans will be at the table?
Oh, well, you just changed the whole dynamic. The answer to that last question, just as you framed it, the answer is no.
The statement by Kellogg reflects the changing nature of Europe's relationship with the US and has forced the continent's leaders to decide whether they now need to take a more proactive role in European security. The UK Business Secretary on Sunday suggested that Britain could act as a bridge between Europe and the United States. Over the weekend, the Prime Minister Keir Starmer said, "This is a once-in-a-generation moment for our national security, where we engage with the reality of the world today and the threat we face from Russia. It's clear Europe must take on a greater role in NATO as we work with the US to secure Ukraine's future and face down the threat we face from Russia." Domestically, Starmer looks set to increase defence spending. It comes as the Ukraine President Volodymyr Zelensky used the Munich conference to call for the creation of a European army, warning the days of US support might well be over. It's clear Europe's leaders have been caught off guard by events in Europe. The next few days could determine whether or not Europe remains a key player in bringing the Ukraine war to an end, or if it will be forced to watch from the sidelines as Donald Trump pushes his own plan to end the conflict.
That was Rahul Pathak reporting. Turning to the Middle East, Hamas has condemned the killing of 3 policemen in an Israeli airstrike near Rafah in southern Gaza, calling it a violation of the ceasefire. Hamas said the officers were securing the entry of 8 trucks into Gaza on Sunday when the airstrike killed them. The strike occurred a day after a hostage prisoner swap with Israel. Meanwhile, U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio said Hamas must be eliminated after meeting with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Rami Amagari reports from Gaza.
An Israeli drone killed 3 Palestinian policemen belonging to Hamas, the Hamas-run police forces, while they were helping secure the entry and the passing of truckloads of aid and good communities. That is according to a statement by the Hamas's Interior Ministry that is responsible for the Hamas police forces. And the statement considered this as a breach of what the statement calls to be a fragile ceasefire. Israel, also an Israeli drone, hit a Palestinian vehicle to the south of Gaza City, mainly in the Mugraga area in central Gaza Strip. This is not the first incident of its type over the past more than 3 weeks of ceasefire between Israel and Hamas. According to local statistics here, local estimates, the number of those killed by Israeli gunfire stands at about 150. In some cases, the Israeli army contends and claims that those killed or shot dead by the Israeli army were approaching areas that the Israeli army had threatened before the truce came into effect, threatened or warned the Palestinians against approaching them. This is in some cases. But this case goes with what the Americans and the Israelis agreed. The Secretary of State, American Secretary of State, also with the Israeli Prime Minister, both agreed that there will be no chance for Hamas to control Gaza, either militarily or politically, which would mean that Israel is proceeding with attacking whoever belongs to Hamas in the occupied in the Gaza Strip, in the coastal enclave, even amidst the truce between Israel and Hamas.
That was Rami Amagari reporting. The Israeli Security Cabinet is due to discuss the next phase of the ceasefire in Gaza. The meeting comes after U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu presented a united front on their approach to Hamas and Iran. Rubio is visiting Israel on his first Middle East trip as the U.S. Secretary of State. Jonathan Rakoff has more from Tel Aviv.
Marco Rubio praising President Trump's plan for Gaza, while also saying that in no way can Hamas remain in power in the Gaza Strip. This is one issue. The other is Iran. Marco Rubio saying it loud and clear, Iran cannot have nuclear weapons. Another issue, an important issue, the one in Lebanon. Let's remember the ceasefire agreement for Lebanon, which has already been extended once, and that extension ends this coming Tuesday. And the Secretary of State saying that the American hopes are for the state of Lebanon and the army of Lebanon to be strong enough to curb Hezbollah and to make sure that Hezbollah does not grow into the power it had before. The message came out of the Israeli Prime Minister's office. I will read it. It says that Benjamin Netanyahu recently spoke with the U.S. President's envoy for the Middle East, Steve Witkoff. The Prime Minister informed the special envoy that he will convene the Security Cabinet to discuss phase 2 of the agreement. And Witkoff saying that the second phase of the negotiations will be more difficult than they were on the first phase, more difficult but still doable. The families are demanding that the second stage happens to see all of the hostages, if possible, to see them coming back to Israel. Every Saturday morning is very emotional here in Israel as we see 3 more hostages coming back. It will put Netanyahu, though, in a difficult position politically as 2 of his far-right parties, one has already left the coalition. The other one said it will leave the coalition if the second stage eventually happens, because that second stage would include the end of the war, the complete Israeli withdrawal from the Gaza Strip. Now negotiations are beginning. Whether it will really happen or not is anyone's guess. We're hearing the American envoy saying it will be very difficult. We also know that the Trump administration has a keen interest in the second phase to happen, because it could perhaps pave the way for a regional normalization deal, one that would include Israel and Saudi Arabia. That is something that the Trump administration would really love to see.
That was Jonathan Rakoff reporting. In Africa, the M23 rebel group has pushed into Bukavu in the Eastern Democratic Republic of the Congo. The Congolese government has accused Rwanda of ignoring calls for a ceasefire. The DRC blames its neighbor for supporting the M23 rebels. Observers say the rebels' rapid advance since the start of the year and the involvement of foreign troops have stoked fears of a broader regional war. Chris Okamringa sent this report from Kinshasa.
Security officials in the Democratic Republic of Congo say the M23 rebels marched into the city of Bukavu on Saturday night after government troops retreated to avoid clashes in the densely populated city. The city is the capital of South Kivu province and an important transport and business hub. Congolese authorities have not confirmed the fall of the city, but the M23 rebel spokesperson says they are now in control. Hundreds of people fled as the rebels advanced towards their city. Some of the fleeing civilians and soldiers looted property. The entry of the rebels in Bukavu comes 2 weeks after they captured the strategic city of Goma in North Kivu province. More than 3,000 people were killed in the fighting between Congolese forces and the M23 rebels. There are fears that the escalation in fighting may widen into a regional conflict. On Saturday, Uganda's Chief of Defense Forces threatened to attack the city of Bunya in the northeast of the DRC if all forces refuse to surrender their arms within 24 hours. His remarks have sparked anger across the DRC. The two countries have a military cooperation agreement to fight rebels of the Allied Democratic Forces. The United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres has said a regional conflict must be avoided at all costs. The UK government has also warned that the growing offensive by the Rwandan-backed rebels in the DRC risks sparking a wider regional conflict. Rwanda has denied supporting the rebels, but several reports by UN experts have confirmed the presence of Rwandan troops fighting alongside the M23 rebels. The fighting has claimed thousands of lives and displaced more than 2 million people since last year.
That was Chris Okamringa on the renewed hostilities in the eastern DRC. Finally, in North America, U.S. President Donald Trump's latest round of executive orders and tariff hikes has drawn fierce criticisms from the global community. It has also started to impact the American economy and trade with other countries. Long Beach, California is already bracing for challenges. Eddie Stiansen has details.
A spring festival celebration is underway in Long Beach, along with representatives from 7 other cities across the Pacific Ocean, all of which are port cities that have built strong trade relations over the years. An economic impact study has shown that 1 in 5 jobs in the city is related directly or indirectly to trade at its port. The latest flurry of tariffs announced by the U.S. President Donald Trump aims to revive domestic manufacturing. But experts say it could take time to build capacity, especially for metals like steel and aluminum.
At minimum, it will be 3 to 5 years, if not longer, for large industrial projects to materialize it. I think it's much easier for advanced manufacturing to be able to deploy right away within a couple of years' time. But under no way or form or shape, one can imagine that one will start to see the manufacturing boom in 6 months. It will not happen. It cannot happen.
Meanwhile, there are fears tariffs could bring much uncertainty to key industries like construction and auto manufacturing, which rely on these raw materials.
When you are running an industry where average car production, the parts, the subsystems travels cross-border 3.5 to 4 times before it actually gets assembled, and you introduce this kind of a friction between cross-border supply chain, it creates a tremendous anxiety, tremendous inefficiency, and tremendous friction. All of this adds up to less productive proposition, higher cost, lower margin, and that makes the entire industry nervous, and rightfully so.
And people at the Long Beach Qingdao Association of Sister Cities say these shifts may be felt by many more businesses and their workers.
Our friends in the business world are worried about whether or not their products will be successful on the market now. And if not, with these new higher prices, will they be forced to lay off people? what will the economic price be, for these people to pay who had nothing to do with the disputes.
Uncertainty looms over port cities like Long Beach, where stable trade relations have meant steady jobs and prosperity for thousands of families.
That was Alice Tiansan reporting. Recapping today's headlines. The Munich Security Conference has wrapped up after 3 days of speeches and talks amid a tense atmosphere. U.S. and Russian officials will have their first face-to-face meeting this week to discuss an end to the conflict in Ukraine. The M23 rebel group has pushed into Bukavu in the Eastern Democratic Republic of the Congo. And that's it for this edition of The Top Story, a podcast that brings you world headlines every weekday. For more news in politics, business, sports, and culture, you can subscribe to The Beijing Hour, a one-hour podcast news magazine program. We welcome and appreciate all ratings and reviews. I'm Tian Yu. Thank you for listening.